Welcome to Making the Cut podcast with Chris Hill and Sean Winter, where we help you succeed in life and business by sharing principles and strategies that guide some of the most successful people in the world.
Welcome back to another episode of the Making the Cut podcast. We are so glad that you've joined us, whether you're a first-time listener or you've been joining us here for a few weeks now. Thank you for being here, and we're excited today to talk to you about management and building a healthy company culture with David Burkus. But before we jump into that, Sean, how about a little bit of humor to get us started?
All right, we're talking about management. We're talking about culture. How about this one? Doing a good job here is like wetting your pants in a dark suit. You get a warm feeling, but no one else notices.
I love it, man. I love it. It's too true. I feel like I've been on the receiving end of that, but I've hopefully not too many times, but also maybe been on the other side of that as well. And I know to help all of us out with that today, we have David Burkus, who's a best-selling author, award-winning podcaster, and is a professor of management at Oral Roberts University. His latest book, Under New Management, challenges the traditional and widely accepted principles of business management and proves that they're outdated, outmoded, or simply don't work, and reveals actually what does. So he gives keynotes all over the world with the United States Navy, Fortune 500 companies, writes for the Harvard Business Review, Inc., and the list goes on. I first got connected with David through his first book and his TED Talk, which is called The Myths of Creativity. Now, Sean, I know you are a management guy. You've also been managed before. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about your experiences?
You know, I think this topic is extremely important, especially when you dive into culture, because I believe in the adage that people don't leave companies, they leave bosses. Now, to me, that's most of the time. There are situations where they would like to stay, they have a great experience, but they leave anyway. But a lot of people are leaving bosses over leaving the company. So I think what we're going to talk about with David as it relates to his book, Under New Management, which, by the way, if you haven't read it, take a look. It contradicts conventional wisdom in a lot of cases. You can just read the chapter listing alone and see some very interesting topics, and he has great data to support it as well. So I think what we're going to talk about is going to be applicable to a lot of different people, because at the end of the day, if you have a winning culture, you're going to have a business that thrives. Absolutely, man. And I can tell you, for me, my first quote unquote real job, I was fresh out of grad school and I was in marketing consulting, and I did not have any of those things. I had a boss that was not very empowering. She didn't really show her appreciation to us, and the list goes on. And as a result, it affected my whole life, not just at work, but I was miserable across the board. So when you have the opposite of this, you have employees who are not only engaged, I think the number is something like only 3 out of 10 employees in the United States are actively engaged in their work, which is pretty sad. So David helps us dive into these, and I know that the conversation we're about to have with him will be super helpful, practical, and will, like you said, Sean, give us some ideas and things to think about that aren't necessarily intuitive and might not have probably thought of before. So with that, let's go ahead and jump right into our conversation with David Burkus. Mr. David Burkus, how are you doing today, sir?
I am fantastic. How are y'all doing?
Doing great. Here in Virginia, actually, where you got your doctorate in Virginia.
We are, yeah. You're from Virginia, so that's why I know I can say y'all instead of like, I'm doing fine. How are you all doing?
And you're out in the Midwest?
I am, yeah. Tulsa, Oklahoma, so still south of the Mason-Dixon line. I don't actually know. Tulsa's weird. Oklahoma is weird. Oklahoma, Texas, and Arkansas don't belong. They're not the South. They're not the Southwest. They're not the North, obviously. They're not the Midwest. We're just this own little Texarkana place. That's also awesome, which is why I live there. But that's a whole other monologue.
And you got your undergraduate there too, I know.
I did. Yep, exactly. So I grew up in New England, and I moved out here to go to school, and I met a girl, and that was the end of the story. Actually, that's the primary decision. But no, I mean, I actually really enjoy it. My siblings, I have 2 older siblings. They both live in really busy metropolitan areas. I've got a lot of other writer and podcaster and speaker friends that live in busy metropolitan areas. And the thing that I always see when I look at their Facebook feed is they're always busy. right? Like they're always invited to this party, or you got to go to that thing, or you got to go support this person because they're in town, etc. Nobody comes to my town, right? And so there's nothing to do but be productive, and I love that. I mean, I make a point to travel to a lot of New York and DC and San Francisco and a lot of other places often because I want to keep the networks up. But when I'm home, it's like uninterrupted focus time. It's awesome.
Well, maybe that's something you can touch on is how you maybe like a high level view of who you are, where you are, obviously in Tulsa, but with your career and how you ended up going down the path of academia versus, I know you were in business for a while before, but how you are down this path now.
Yeah, that's funny. Sorry, we dived into all of this stuff because Chris and I have known each other forever before we did the normal bio and any of that. But so I'm kind of an accidental academic, or I actually like now to refer myself as a recovering academic. But what happened was I actually always knew I was going to end up writing books. It was one of those things that like books were my version of Chris and food, right? I always sort of knew this was cool. I went to university. I went to undergrad to study English, study writing, and thought I was going to be like the great American novelist, like an Ernest Hemingway, but like without the life outcomes. And while I was there, I took a couple classes in social science and organizational communication, in the psychology of persuasion, all sorts of things that just fascinated me. And this is when, this was right around when the first people to really make popular books on social science were coming out, right? So Gladwell's Tipping Point, like he migrated from writing New Yorker articles to the Tipping Point, that had come out. And this was kind of right at the beginning of like Daniel Pink, and it was a little bit before Chip and Dan Heath, but like you started following the breadcrumbs. Like if I like this author, maybe I should read this thing and read this thing. And then eventually by the time I had graduated as an undergrad, I sort of resolved to like, this is the genre for me. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to write books that blend social science research or what I kind of now call better living through social science type of books with the ability to tell a good story, because that's really Gladwell's forte, is that he's an amazing storyteller. Now, I also knew that I probably wasn't going to be as awesome a storyteller as Malcolm Gladwell anytime soon, so maybe I should double down on the science part, because I'm probably not going to get to his level on the storytelling part. So that's what I did. I went to graduate school for organizational psychology, and then eventually did a doctorate in strategy and leadership. The whole idea was actually I want to understand these concepts more so I can migrate them from the university life to the world of practitioners, the entrepreneurs, the corporate executives, even just the individuals that needed better living through social science. So that was the idea. Now, midway through that, a couple different things happened. I was making my living. Actually, I sold drugs out of the back of my car, literally. Not in like a Ryan Blair former gang member thing. I was a pharmaceutical representative. And it was the perfect job for a 20-something-year-old who was married to a medical student, right? So I got to sort of understand my wife's industry a bit better. And then a couple different things happened. One of the biggest ones was the signing of the Affordable Care Act, which made me realize this industry is going to change, right? Like love Obamacare, hate Obamacare, I don't care. But when you're in the industry, you're like, this industry is going to change. I should probably look for a life raft now before everybody else does. So that's kind of what I did. And when that turned into an opportunity to transition over and enter university as a professor and actually teach courses, it was like, okay, yeah, this is cool. And it goes along with the long-term goal, which was always to write about this stuff. So I made that jump, which was a pretty big income drop, but it also gave me a lot of time to like really focus on scaling this dream of being a writer about these kind of topics. So that's what we did. And I haven't really looked back.
Talking about that time period when you made that leap, right? And you said you took that pay cut, you jumped on that life raft. What was that period like? Because a lot of people that follow Chris or follow Entrepreneurial Chef, they want to take that leap, but they're so terrified that it's not going to work out. What was that like for you, and how did you get past that period?
Yeah, so I mean, it was a little weird. I'm in a little bit different of a spot, right? Because I have the fortune of being married to a physician. So it was sort of like I always like it was one of those things where it wasn't like the world was going to end, right? It was more like worst case scenario, the next 4 to 5 years are going to suck. Right, because we got to wait for her to get through med school and residency and all that sort of stuff. So it wasn't. I think that's truthfully, I think that's the biggest hurdle for a lot of people making that jump, is that it's a jump into the unknown with no known end point. And I had an end point. And I think the big difference that a lot of people don't realize is that they also have an end point. Like you cannot be a failing entrepreneur for the rest of your life. Eventually, if you make the leap and it fails, eventually you go back and you find a job, right? So there is, even when you're making that leap, it's not permanent. And that was the biggest thing that made it easier for me, was I could clearly see it was not permanent because of the rest of the circumstances going on in the life of my wife and her career and all that sort of stuff. I think what most people don't do is they don't tell themselves that this is not permanent. If I'm jumping off to go start my own thing, it's not permanent. I will either succeed and it'll be awesome, or I will fail and I'll go back and get another job, spend a couple years paying down everything, getting settled again, and then I'll jump again, right? So it's never permanent.
Kind of like the idea of, you were speaking about Seth Godin a few minutes ago before we got on to recording, but talking about him and like the dip with, you jump into something and, knowing that there's that in place down the road makes it a lot easier. If you have that end goal in mind, knowing that you can get through it versus just kind of swimming around for time, not going anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've got to be careful here and say, like, I definitely very rarely looked at it through the standpoint of like, well, if everything fails and I become a disgrace, at least I can, mooch off of my spouse. It wasn't necessarily like that, but it was this idea of like, I honestly think it was Dale Carnegie in one of the books that no one ever talks about, because, there's How to Win Friends and Influence People, and then there's like 7 other books. He talks about one of the questions to ask yourself often to overcome fear is to literally to very seriously ask yourself the question, what's the worst thing that could happen to you? Right. Mm-hmm. And if the answer is not die penniless and alone, then yeah, you're probably going to be okay. And so this was, I was thinking about that, reading about that at the time, et cetera. And there's a lot of interesting science now in psychology behind sort of how that works. But if you can visualize your future self, successful and not successful, and the not successful and still not that bad, then go for it, because you're not actually risking anything other than wasting time.
Yeah, very cool. So it was literally one Saturday, I pull up my email, I'm looking through, I have an email from Ted when your talk was featured.
Yeah.
I forwarded it to you, or I screenshotted it or something.
You did. And not to ruin it for you, but you're not special. I had 4 or 5 of them. I think yours was first. I'll give you that, but you're on the East Coast. No, I mean, it was actually kind of a surreal moment because I was actually on vacation. I kind of thought they were going to be done with promotion that in particular Saturday, right? Gotcha. So the talk went live on a Tuesday and had this, sort of initial spike, and I kind of thought that was it. I didn't realize that most people are like yourself. They actually only subscribe to the once a week TED email. So we had a big bump in viewership. And, so what's interesting about this, to rewind. So in January of last year, I gave a talk on one of the ideas in my new book, Underneath Management, salary transparency. And we deliberately chose it because we knew it was going to be controversial, and we hoped that would mean more people than like 6 watch it, right? But it wasn't one of those ideas that I thought I would sort of turn into the total champion for. It wasn't like there's 13 ideas in the book, and I was like, this one's a really good one. But they're like kids. You sort of don't have a favorite, right? So we give the talk, and I kind of feel like, all right, that's it. Later it gets all edited around February. It comes out, gets some initial traction. I think like. Probably 15, 20,000 views or something like that on the YouTube channel. And I'm kind of like, that's it. And to be honest with you, part of me was relieved, right? Because you should never read the comments. Everybody says that.
Oh, but
you read the comments. And part of me was kind of relieved because I was like, oh, cool. This thing will just sort of fade off into the amorphous blob that is the internet. And I don't have to get all of these threatening comments anymore. And then around April or so, we got an email that basically said like, hey, just keeping you in the loop, Ted has requested that we send all of the video and audio and everything from your talk. They're looking at re-editing it and putting it on the front page of TED.com. And that was an interesting moment, right? Speaking of fear, that was an interesting moment. It was like, on the one hand, you're like, cool, this is going to be really cool. On the other hand, you're like, oh, I've already read the comments and more of them are going to come, right? And because the thing that I've learned, 1.3 million views later, no one is no one's apathetic about this issue. Everyone either thinks like, yes, this is amazing and you're right, and I don't see why it's a big deal and it would really help with employee relations, or they're like, this is none of your business. You don't deserve it, blah, blah, blah. Shut up. You don't even know. And nobody's in the middle. Nobody's like, I've never gotten an email that says, hey, you're a really good presenter, but your idea, I've never gotten that. I've only ever gotten hate mail or love mail. It's the weirdest thing.
Which leads to more comments too.
Right. Exactly. So, all in all, I got to be honest with you, an amazing experience. Like, there really is sort of a TED effect to spreading an idea out there, which has been really, really cool. But really, it's just that kind of. I mean, you do the type of work that I do because you have ideas that you want to see. Like what I always say is that I make it. What I strive to do is make good ideas easier to apply. And this was an example. There's a lot of great research on salary transparency and a lot of companies that are doing it, but they're not relatively well known. And this was a great way to get what I believe is a really good idea much easier for people to apply and see how it can apply, even if it's not taking the leap to go from full secrecy to full transparency, taking that first step, which I think is really important. So it's been a really fun experience overall. Could use a little less of the hate mail, a little more of the love mail. But other than that, it's been a great experience.
It's one of those polarizing topics. People love it, people hate it, but they're not in the middle. And it's tough to be in that situation. Now, speaking of the book, Under New Management, what sparked your interest to put this together to begin with?
So the easiest way to answer that is actually to go back to the first book, to the end of the first book, right? So the first book that I wrote is called Myths of Creativity, and it's all about the sort of misconceptions we have about the creative process and also how it's supposed to work. And you can't really write a book about creativity and innovation and not end up talking about a certain subset of companies, your 3Ms, your Googles, your IDEO, et cetera, because these are consistently the most innovative companies out there. So you're going to end up writing about them. And when you write about them, you start to notice they do things a little bit differently. And they do things differently because they believe creativity works differently than a lot of people who dismiss themselves as uncreative feel like it's supposed to work. But that's a whole other monologue maybe we'll have time for. But suffice it to say, that was sort of the thing that I took away from that book is the unexplored rabbit trail I wanted to kind of go down, which is they're doing things differently. Why? And so that's what we started. That's the kind of the rabbit trail we started going down was what are the things that companies are doing differently from like The Office, or doing differently from the age of Frederick Taylor and the age of Peter Drucker and the 1 Minute Manager. Management looks really different right now. Why? And then also, like, is there because again, my background is social science, is there a social science reason behind why this is working? So I wanted to be able to tell the story of the companies that made this switch, but also say whether they knew it or not, here's the research into human behavior that explains why it all worked so well. So that became Under New Management. We started with a few more than 13 practices. I think we started probably closer to 20. And then ones either weren't actually that different from certain things or didn't have any social science research behind them. You suspect that they just sort of lucked into it, right? And we arrived at 13, which was kind of weird. Unlucky number 13, but whatever. It's worked out. It's worked out pretty well. So that was the impetus, the desire to kind of tell the story of these different things, but also explain here's the research behind it again, so that you can make this good idea easier to apply.
And I can't remember. I think it might be in the afterword. Is that what it's called? The forward afterward.
That's actually a good question. I don't actually know. The little thing that happens at the end of the book, I don't remember what we called it this time around. We did call it the afterword. So
okay, yeah.
Other introduction, which is probably wrong, but I don't, no one's ever told me this. When you write a book, you think there's things that they're gonna tell you, like how to do your dedication page, for example. They never tell you. They just expect you to know. Yep,
30 of the Wolves. But in the afterword, you talk about, and I can't remember what type of engine it is, but how when you actually look at the engine, it's only like 30% efficient.
Yeah, the internal combustion engine. So the one that's in all of ours, whether you've got a 4-cylinder, V6, V8, Hemi, whatever you've got, the internal combustion engine is 30% efficient is a weird way of explaining this. Okay, so it's not like fuel efficiency. That's actually sort of a made up thing that car companies did hide this other efficiency thing. This other efficiency has to do with literally just with the laws of thermodynamics. So gasoline, at least until at least a couple of years from now when Elon Musk solved this problem, gasoline still tends to be one of the most economical ways to store pure energy, right? It just is. That's why we're addicted to fossil fuels. And when we can get to a place where we can store sunlight and wind energy and all that other stuff, I'm really nerding out on this. Sorry. Suffice it to say, put gasoline into a car. That gasoline has a certain amount of energy in it. When it goes to your engine, it explodes. 30% of the energy in that gasoline is translated into forward motion. The rest is lost in the explosion. It's lost to heat, it's lost to friction, a bunch of other things from a physics textbook I had to read to do this book that I don't remember. But the rest of it is lost, right? And I think it's an interesting analogy for organizations because organizations have to deal with energy as well. Way back in the day when like Frederick Taylor was trying to figure out how to run a factory well, or when, Ray Kroc was trying to figure out how to run a fast food restaurant well, you had repetitive motions, physical motions. You didn't have no one needed to think, but you did need their physical energy. And so management became the system that we use to capture people's physical energy and turn it into productivity. Now, and it worked okay, but now we're in a little bit different place where most people do creative work. Most people solve problems. Most people have to use higher levels of thinking than Frederick Taylor or Ray Kroc ever envisioned for their employees. I actually, the employees at McDonald's still probably don't need to do it, but you get what I mean. Most Americans have to do that. And so we need a different way to kind of discuss energy and manage energy. And that falls into what is called a couple different measurements, the biggest one being employee engagement. Ironically, employee engagement in the United States, at least, is right around 30%. So the tools that we're using to manage today's employees are about as efficient as the internal combustion engine. And that's good news and bad news. If you're satisfied with 30%, awesome. If you're an entrepreneur in particular, and you are trying to make more out of less every single day, that number should scare the heck out of you, right? And you should be thinking about what are the ways that I can get people to be more engaged in their work, to, let's be honest, to do more and put forth more productive effort for the same amount of time and resources. But at the same time, do it in a way that they enjoy it so that they have a workplace that they enjoy and gives them even more energy, et cetera. These are the questions that, to be honest with you, entrepreneurs ask themselves far more than do senior managers or middle managers at big bureaucratic organizations. And that's one of the reasons why a majority of the companies that are profiled in under new management are startups and are still very entrepreneurial organizations, is they're trying to solve that problem. They need a better engine.
And you have a wide variety of industries that you use. And I would think that it's because these entrepreneurs are still there on the front lines and seeing everything in action.
Well, I think it's also because they can experiment, right? When you have, for the salary transparency, for example, when you're Buffer or you're Sumall and you have 27 employees, the risks of experimentation aren't as perilous, right? I get that. Now, that's not to say you can't innovate. Whole Foods also did the salary transparency thing, and they did it when they had hundreds, if not thousands of employees. So you can do it, but I get that it's a lot riskier when you have that many people involved. It's usually a little bit easier when you're a smaller organization to innovate your management practices.
Yeah, and something that you were talking about earlier, I feel like the hub of that employee engagement is autonomy, something that you talk about a great deal. Do you agree with that, or do you think that there's more of a root reason that would cause employees to be more engaged?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different factors that contribute to employee engagement. And we could actually get into a super nerdy discussion about who's got the best way to measure employee engagement, but we'll save that. Suffice it to say, even if autonomy is not the biggest contributing factor to engagement, it's the biggest factor that is doable. Right? In other words, for you as a boss or you as the entrepreneur, as the leader, giving your people autonomy to say how they do their work, when they do their work, and to some extent even what they work on, that's the easiest thing. That's the best combination of easiest to give up and most potent for employee engagement. So it's definitely, it's one of the best for that reason.
Well, and it kind of touches on, in the book, you refer to Netflix, I believe, when they the vacation policy, and one of the points you make is how it's not about the days off. It's about the trust that you give the employees to determine the outcome.
Yeah, and trust is huge, and this is one of the interesting ones because I actually started writing and researching the unlimited vacation practice, and Sean, I was more thinking like you, like, oh, this is a simple autonomy thing, like this is giving people a say over their vacation days. Clearly, that's autonomy, et cetera. And then when you dive into some of the quotes that the senior leaders of Netflix use and some of these other companies, and in particular, when you look at Netflix, they switched to unlimited vacation, and then almost immediately after it's been judged a success, they take the same principle and they apply it to expense reports. So now we're not talking about time off. We're talking about people spending their money. And it works again. There's clearly something deeper than just giving people a say over when they work, autonomy, right? There's clearly something deeper. And that's when you find these quotes that, no, actually, it's about trust. It's about doing things that signal every leader, every entrepreneur, every senior leader of a company, even middle managers, they all have to make decisions about how they manage their people, how they keep track of their people, et cetera. And there are little subtle ways that they can do that signal distrust or signal trust. And trust is a really interesting thing. It's not earned, it's not given, it's reciprocated. It comes from this delicate dance of giving and reciprocating, sort of an upward spiral. You can't just earn trust if no one ever takes the risk to trust in you. And likewise, there's kind of no point acting trustworthy if people aren't open to trusting you. Now, I mean, there's a moral reason, but beyond that. So it's this reciprocal dance that has to happen. And for Netflix and for a lot of consumer affairs I talk about in there, as well as a couple of other companies that do unlimited vacation, it really was more about this is a way we're signaling distrust to our employees and it's damaging us. So let's get rid of it for that reason. How many days vacation they take is irrelevant. It's a whole lot better to send the message that we trust our people to do their best work.
With that being such a root cause, I feel like that it becomes a calculated risk for some companies or even entrepreneurs. It's really hard for companies, I think, to just have a blanket trust policy and they can trust them about everything, right? So it's almost like for those that really want to institute this into their companies, they have to really map out an area in which they can start that trust process and then let it unfold to other areas. Do you see what I'm saying there?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. It does have to grow, right? And that's why it's this sort of reciprocal thing. It grows through that reciprocation. I think for a leader looking to do this, there's kind of two questions or two stages you have to look at. The first would be, is there a pain point already where my people don't feel trusted, right? And this is what happened with Netflix. There are people were complaining about, you're not tracking our days on when we're coming into the office, what we're working on, et cetera. Why do you demand we track our days off? And they didn't have a good answer, right? So right away, there's a signal that there's a current practice that's happening that's signaling distrust. Then you've got to ask yourself the question, like, okay, if I do away with this practice, what's ironically, to go back to Dale Carnegie, what's the worst that could happen, right? What could we stand to lose out? And you think about vacation days, like, what's the worst that could happen? Well, probably 2 or 3 employees are going to just start taking weeks off at a time and turn into terribly lazy employees. Okay, well, what would we do then? Well, we would, what's a euphemism here? Share them with our competition, right? And we take care of those 2 or 3 people. And then what happens with everybody else? Well, everybody else probably, has the same amount of vacation and feels trusted, right? So you have to go through those 2 stages. Is this an area where it's clearly already causing pain and removing it would cause more trust? And can I afford to be sort of wrong? If I end up being wrong about this area, does it make the company go bankrupt, or does it just cost us a couple of vacation days?
And that kind of ties back into maybe the same kind of ideas of a later chapter in the book talking about firing employees with bonuses. Like it keeps the good people around, and it gets rid of the people that aren't going to be a part of the company culture that you want anyway.
Yeah, so this is the paying to quit chapter, right? And I think this is super interesting. I actually I just hired an assistant, my first ever sort of like, I need somebody to help me.
Congratulations.
Survive. Oh, thank you. But like from the author side, like I've managed people before from running through an organizational life, et cetera. But from the author side of like, wow, our business is to the point where I need help instead of being the solo entrepreneur. But anyway, I'm talking with her. And she's talking about she's coming on with me, so she's leaving her previous organization. She's talking about banked time off and all that sort of stuff. I'm like, oh, it's almost like you get a quitting bonus. And then she's like, no, it's not a quitting bonus because you're not going to offer me to quit. I'm like, oh, you're right. That refers to something totally different. That refers to like a Zappos and offering someone money to leave the company, right? Instead of just earning out your time off and getting a little goodbye bonus. But anyway, Yeah, so this is really interesting to me, this phenomenon. So the idea is exactly what it seems. If you've never heard of this idea, the idea is exactly as it sounds like. Some companies do it, like Zappos do it within the first sort of 4 weeks of you coming onto the organization. Some companies like Amazon.com do it annually for certain employees. Others, it's just a freestanding kind of like permitted offer. And different companies obviously do it for different reasons. There's two big reasons why it works. One is the one that you referred to. It's a really easy way to sort of have the garden tend its own weeds, right? If you are the type of person that realizes this is not your culture, then we'll pay a month's or sometimes 2 months take for you to go find a new job. We would rather pay you out that small thing than have you be looking for a job for a long period of time, then you don't quit until you start the other job. So then we have to spend time filling your positions. We'd rather just shorten that as much as possible, make your life as easy as possible to self-select out. The other reason I think it's really interesting is what it does to the people who stay. There's a thing in psychology and human behavior that we've known about for a long time called confirmation bias. We selectively filter in or filter out information that already confirms what we believe. I mean, my goodness, 2017 presidential politics, we definitely see confirmation bias on hand almost all the time, right? Whatever you already believed, you're just going to find information that supports that already. And so the quitting bonus actually does this, right? If I offered you 2 months salary to quit and you turned me down, you are subconsciously filtering in or out information that confirms that you made the right choice, that taking the money and running was the wrong choice, that no, this is a really good place to be, and that's why I didn't take the money. Or no, I'm really doing really great work that I enjoy and it's not worth giving up, et cetera. All of the little subtle things that are going on kind of in the back of your mind and your subconscious make for a more engaged employee.
In talking about all the different chapters and running through the book, I'm curious, when you look at the book as a whole, what was one of the most profound discoveries you had or revelations you had, whether it was researching the book, writing the book? What was one of the most profound discoveries?
So, you know what's funny is I actually kind of already hinted at this a little bit in my answer to your trust question, right? Which is, this is something maybe I find it profound because it happened after I finished the book. Like, and this is the weird thing about books. They're never like done. The ideas in them are never done. They're just a snapshot in time. And it wasn't until after I had written it, published it, was talking about it with some friends of mine who had read early drafts, but like it was too late to change anything significantly, that I realized that of the 13 practices, the vast majority of them are practices of elimination. They're not things that you have to add on to your company or add on to, your startup, whatever it is. They're actually policies or practices that get birthed out of trying to remove something that's frustrating. So they're actually, unlimited vacation is a great example. It comes from saying this means people aren't trusted, so we're going to remove it. But the majority of them turn out to be that way. They turn out to be the result of people saying this is a hindrance to doing our best work, so we're going to remove it, which I think is encouraging because, to be honest with you, that makes the leader's job a whole lot easier, right? Because if the biggest impacting factors on employee engagement are actually your ability to identify the things your employees hate and find a way to be a barrier between you and them, or practices that people hate and find a way to remove them, that's pretty cool, because that's a whole lot easier than like reading a ton of different leadership books and coming up with the perfect model of leadership that will work 100% of the time, right? Maybe the perfect model of leadership is like figure out where your people want to go and then block all the things that'll tear them down from getting there.
David, just a few more questions, and then we can start to wrap things up. But one of my favorite quotes from the book, and actually I was going back over, doing a little more research, getting ready for the show, I saw your talk at Google up in Boston, I guess it was, and how one of the big things that you kind of maybe aha moment or a story that you talk about is with, I can't remember the company it was, but where the leader of the company said, great leaders don't innovate the product, they innovate the factory.
Yeah, Dane Atkinson of Sumall.
That's right.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I have and Sean as well, have a lot of folks in the culinary industry where there's, the factories, it's often very tenuous. There's a lot of challenges. Anything can go wrong. There's, different academic levels, sometimes language barriers, a lot of different things that can kind of get in the way. Maybe you have a few ideas about that.
Yeah, and this is sort of an extension of what we were just talking about with what is the leader's core job. And so this comes from Dane Atkinson. Dane was a really interesting guy. So this actually piggybacks on that internal combustion engine metaphor, right? That Dane, until we talked, didn't see this way. It sort of came, it was this weird insight that neither of us can claim, but we sort of had when I was doing the interview with him, was that, his job is to build a better engine. His job as the leader now isn't, when he first started the company, it was to do a lot of different tasks, and then it was to hire people that could do those tasks for him. And now his job is to tend to the engine and make it more and more efficient. And so I initially came to interview him about salary transparency, and then we're talking about, he's actually curious, like he's leaning forward to me. Well, what are some of the other practices you're writing about? What are the other things that other companies are doing, et cetera? And I'm just I made a joke about how curious he was about all of these things. Come to find out, he probably does like 7 or 8 of them now after the book's been out for a little while, which is really kind of cool. But also, like, I'm wondering, why are you so curious? And he said, well, isn't this what it's all about? Great leaders don't innovate the product, they innovate the factory. And to use the Frederick Taylor and factory analogy, I mean, obviously not as many employees work in factory settings anymore, but factory is this metaphor for anywhere we do work. And, he really saw it. My job as a leader is to shape the factory, to shape the engine, to shape the way that we do work in a way that gets out people's best work, not just to gain value for a little bit of money, but also in a way that's intrinsically rewarding and motivating to them. And I think it's a concept that applies in a variety of different fields. Like I look at, and I only talk about him very briefly in the book, but in hospitality, I look at Danny Meyer and Union Square Hospitality Group and the things that he and they are constantly doing to innovate the way that they treat employees, the way that employees interact with each other, et cetera. We tend to think about innovation as just a product thing. So in food, it would be literally the menu or maybe the ambiance or the service or something like that. But like Danny Meyer's standpoint is like, well, if we make this better for employees, if I innovate the way employees are working, all of these other things will happen. Great service will happen as an accident of taking care of my people. So that's what I'm going to focus on innovating.
Something that I believe ties to this that you talk about is how conflict can spark creativity when you control it in the right way. Right. So can you kind of run through that on how does conflict spark creativity and how can that lead to potential innovation in a company moving forward?
Yeah, so let me clarify my thinking on that a little bit. I actually kind of feel like conflict sparks creativity, period, full stop. There's just a question of whether or not it leads to people quitting. So you don't necessarily need to keep it controlled for the creativity's sake. You need to keep it controlled so people stick around. And that's the sort of challenge is teaching people how to have conflict in a way where they stay at the table instead of moving apart from it. But one of the things I found is interesting is even when there is conflict, like if you and I argued about something, we might never talk to each other again. But every time we replay that argument, we're thinking about our point a little bit more clearly, and we're coming up with new, I wish I would have said this, et cetera. We're being more creative about it, even if we're never talking to each other again. I obviously want us to keep talking to each other again. So, yeah, let's keep it controlled for that reason. But yeah, this is something that, if you study the history of creativity, Alex, it's hard to think of brainstorming in particular as having an inventor. Alex Osborne is the inventor of brainstorming. He wrote a book. He was an ad executive. He wrote a book called Apply Imagination, and it was a bunch of different techniques that he and his ad men used to come up with great ideas. And in one section of the book, he talks about brainstorming. He says, we do this exercise. We all go into a room. The exercise, we have 4 specific rules. And then, of course, if I ask you might not remember all 4 rules of brainstorming, but if I ask you what rule number 1 is, what's rule number 1? It's always defer judgment. Mm-hmm. And so no one ever tested this idea. No one ever questioned it, right? And yet what can happen often is that deferring judgment, especially when you're doing it yourself, is either a sign that your people aren't having any great ideas or that they're deliberately choosing to sacrifice those ideas on the altar of consensus and cohesiveness. And so they're not sharing them. And that's hugely dangerous because all creativity is combinatorial. Ideas come from building upon other ideas. And if there are people who are censoring themselves because their idea conflicts with what's out there now, we don't get their idea to build off of. And so that's why conflict in tests, when people started finally doing tests of brainstorming and testing this one variable, criticism and conflict actually yielded more and better creative ideas, because ideas are combinatorial. And if someone is self-selecting out because they don't want conflict, depriving the whole group of the ability to use that idea to build towards something new.
And if you approach conflict in a healthy way where we might have a heated disagreement, but at the end of the day, we talk through it. We can actually maybe grow through it and be stronger and more cohesive as a unit, which could then actually potentially build more trust, and then that leads potentially to more creativity down the road as well.
Totally. And it's important to emphasize we're focused here on task focused conflict, not people centered conflict, right? So it's criticism of the idea, not criticism of the person sharing the idea. And this is, Shane, to your point about keeping controls on it, this is the big control. Often what can happen is even if you're doing everything you can to stay task focused, someone might still take it personally. And if they then respond with a personal conflict, now the argument sort of devolves into this petty little thing. So putting limits on it and really shaping a culture that says type 1 conflict, task-oriented, is okay, type 2 conflict is off limits, and refining that can help create a much more creative culture for that reason.
Well, Dan, thanks for joining us, man. It's been a blast hanging out. You, I know you're a busy guy doing a lot of speaking. Obviously, are you in class in the summer as well, or?
No. So there are a couple times where for our graduate programs that have sort of online supplemental classes, I'll run something, but I try not to show up on campus at all unless I need to print something in large volume, which I probably shouldn't admit publicly, but there's that. So no, for most of the summer, I'm either out on the road or I'm at home working on writing or something like that, or taking a lot of vacation because academics don't get unlimited vacation. You can have as much vacation as you want as long as it happens between the end of one semester and the beginning of another.
Right. Well, I have one final question, but Sean, do you have any other questions you wanted to touch on before we wrap things up?
Nope. Go for it, Chris.
Are your books required reading for your students?
Oh, I hate this. Yes, they are. And I go into detail on the very first day of class about why they are.
And that's right. Amazon review too, right?
Well, they could get some extra credit, No, and they are. I mean, it started with the Missive Creativity. They are essentially because before that book was published, I was still teaching a class on creative thinking in business, and I had all of these different articles and excerpts and book chapters and all this sort of stuff. And then when I managed to put all of my thinking into one cohesive thing, it just made more sense to assign that instead of a bunch of other things. But what I tell them often is there are in the academic world, there are professors that are really hugely guilty of that. They write a textbook, costs $200, and then all of their students are required to do it. My stance is always like, this book is like $15. You buying it is going to make me enough money to get a soda. Like I'm not doing this for the financial reasons. I'm doing this because it'll actually be less for you to read, because otherwise I would give you this stack of articles you'd have to read. So I do it to make your life easier.
I was just busting your balls, but yeah.
No, I know. Trust me. It's one of those things that I hate that I do it, but it really does make the most sense.
Well, and it doesn't feel like you're reading a textbook either. It's you can grab it at Barnes and Nobles versus having to go to the college supply store and hopefully you can get one that's been used for $80 instead of 15 or 20, whatever it is.
Yeah, totally.
Well, any final kind of thoughts you have to leave the audience with?
No, I mean, I'm really excited to be here. I think this is one, I think there's a tendency, especially in this space, to feel like, oh, well, such and such idea won't work for you. But I guarantee you the one thing that works in every industry, in every sector, and in every company is listening to your employees, figuring out what's keeping them from doing their best work and getting rid of it. And that is actually ends up being the core of under new management. There's a bunch of ways how to do that in there, but that's the big one. And that applies no matter what type of business you're starting.
And kind of picking and choosing which of the 13 can work for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Where can everybody connect with you, David?
So the best place to find me is probably davidburkus.com, Burkus. I've got a weird last name, which is great because all of the domains and URLs and usernames and stuff like that are open. From there's more info about the books. There's more info about, I run a podcast called Radio Free Leader. So if you have hated the last 40 minutes or so, you're going to hate the podcast. But if you've enjoyed this, please come on over, check it out. And all of that is at davidburkus.com.
And 7 years deep with the podcast.
Yeah, well, not 7 good years, but the last couple have been stellar. So come check those out.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, David Burkus. It was a pleasure having you, man.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me.
So that was our conversation with David Burkus, and we covered a lot of ground there. Sean, for you, did anything stand out in particular?
For me, Chris, it's the topic of trust and how that can make such an impact, positively or negatively, on a company, on the team, for results. I think trust is huge. And I love what we talked about with him as it relates to those that want trust have to give trust. It's an action that you have to take. So I love that topic. What about you, Chris?
Yeah, just to touch on that exact idea in my own life at work. For the first couple years of the restaurant being open, I was so scared to ever leave for even a shift because, I'm not there. What happens if something goes wrong? Well, once I finally gave the trust to my team to execute the way I knew that they could, I realized, wow, the place, it didn't burn down. Things were just fine. And it's such a liberating feeling. So I encourage anyone out there to give trust to the employees, and in return, they will trust you back. For me, Sean, a lot of it, obviously the trust is huge, but a lot of it too is just taking all these interesting ideas that a lot of us probably hadn't really ever thought of before. And it all really kind of boils down to, how can I create a better relationship with my employee, but also my relationship with the employee to their work itself? How can I create an environment where they can do their best work? I love where he said, a great leader figures out what gets in the way of their employees doing their best work and then finds a way to get rid of it. It's that simple, really. So I love the book. I love what David's doing. You can follow him on social media at David Burkus, Burkus, pretty much everywhere. We'd love for you to let us know what you think about this episode. Share it with your friends and tell us what you think. Leave a comment here down below on the website or anywhere on social media and let us know. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And subscribe to iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever else you might listen to your podcast. Thank you for joining us. And Sean, why don't you go ahead and leave us with a departing final word?
We're going to do a quote from David Burkus himself. Time away from work makes work better. Thanks for tuning in, everyone.